Afternoon. This is the Pickens County Board of County Commissioners regular meeting on February 11th, 2015. John, are there any additions or deletions to the agenda?
Yes, we have one addition, which would be an executive session at the end of the meeting for purpose of attorney advice. And we can give the citation when we go in.
At the motion, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any members of the public who would wish to make a comment at this time? Mr. Buettner.
Louis Buettner. I'm here basically to get a status report on the subdivision complaint I put in on the Crown Mountain Ranch amended subdivision plat. As I haven't heard anything, and I am very interested, because as I said, there was 17 items in error on that plat, and we're running out of time. So at what point are we?
We'll have our attorney, John Ely, will respond to that.
The status report, I guess, is from me because I'm the one who has it, and I'm still looking at it. And I would assume, if you want to give me a call, that I would probably get through it because your report was pretty in depth, I have to say, and probably certainly before the end of the month, depending on how many other people might grab me from staff side or county side.
Well, as I stated in my little complaint, well, it's been 9 years, and we're running out of time on getting the surveyor to do something.
Okay.
Lou, when you say we are running out of time, is there a statutory...
There is a statute of limitations that, I'm not an attorney, so I can't interpret it as such, but it's a 10-year statute of limitations, but it has a 3-year time on discovery. So we may have 3 years, we may only have 10 years.
Typically, it's from the point of discovery.
So otherwise, it's there. As I say, this subdivision took county land as part of the subdivision. And I'm not happy with that. So as a result, I would like to be kept in the network as to what's going on.
No problem.
Okay, well, you know, we passed it on right away, and there is staff working on it. And John, if we could, or if you could keep Lou in the loop on that, just when there's an update or decision to be made or anything like that.
Sure.
That'd be good. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Lou.
Thanks, Lou.
Are there any other comments from the public about any subjects not on the agenda today? Okay, seeing none, are there any commissioner comments?
I just have
Patty?
a really quick one. I would just like to ask the public to please do your snow dances. We are desperately in need of snow. Looking at the river when I was walking in today and thinking about spring runoff, I know the snowpack is borderline at the top of Independence Pass, but we have no snowpack in town, and so we need to get out there and do some snow dances. We need some of that snow coming to Boston to come our way, so just want the public to help us out a little bit. Thanks, Steve.
I always thought that if we all wash our cars on the same
I just
day.
did, so maybe that's, actually I just did it. It snowed last night, but not enough to, only enough to get my car dirty, so.
Any other comments?
No.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to consent actions. There's approval of minutes of work sessions of January 13th, January 20th, and January 27th, and the regular meeting of January 28th.
So moved.
Second?
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve. Any comments?
We just had the corrections, but Steve, did you want to add something to?
No, the two
okay?
corrections were the ones that you also had
So
seen,
we're clean
and so
on
they've
that.
already got the message on that.
Yep, yep.
Okay. Right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, moving to consent actions, first readings, which will be set for public hearing on February 25th. There are three of them. The first, an ordinance authorizing Smuggler Mountain Minerals open space acquisition, and Matt Adeletti's here from Open Space.
Good afternoon. I think we have a map, but not sure.
Do you want to project it?
I'd like to.
We can get stuff.
And I'm not. I didn't bring a flashlight with me. It's probably not going to work. Okay. You have lots.
We all have maps. The public doesn't have maps. We could maybe hold one up that the TV camera could.
There we go.
Okay.
So this was Matt Adeletti, Acquisition Manager for Open Space and Trails. This was an interesting acquisition that we did. I've never done one through auction before. But we've been working for years with the with Ed Smart's mining claims and trying to get an understanding of what he owns and what the county would like to purchase. And so we finally kind of dialed it in on some of the mining claims that we did want to acquire out of all the whole list of all these different types of interests. 1/16th interest in this one mining claim and all these different interests. However, this was one that we really wanted because this is 100% of the mineral rights under, I'm going to say 60 acres of mining claims that Open Space owns in the fee interest, but we didn't own the minerals below 500 feet. Those are owned 100% by Ed Smart's, his trust. So this was something that just came to us in the past couple months, and we were trying to figure out what the price was and that kind of thing, and then we suddenly heard it went to auction, and it was going to be an auction in about a week. So we had to jump on this. So Will had talked to our Open Space Board of Trustees to get approval to go ahead with this, which they did, and so they gave us a limit of what we could spend at the auction, and we went to the auction, and there was two different interests that we were looking at acquiring. One of them was up by Little Annie Road, but we were outbid on that within the first 60 seconds. However, this was one that we did have some competition on, but we came in under our amount that we were allotted. I think it was 50 or 60,000, but this one we acquired for 25,000. Actually, not 25,000. Sorry, it was 3,400. 34,000.
34,000.
Sorry. So it includes these mining claims. All of these that are listed in red. The ones in red are all Open Space, Smuggler Mountain Open Space, and then you have the Joplin Lode here, which is part of it, and then you have the Pontiac and the Grand Turk, which are not part of the Open Space property. However, those were owned by AVLT and transferred to the Forest Service, and that was part of the packet that we were approved to purchase because they are so close to our Open Space property there that if any potential mining could occur, that would be a big impact on the adjacent open space. So we went ahead and did the acquisition on that, but because it happened so quickly, we weren't able to come to the county commissioners to get your approval first. So we're coming here now for this first reading, and then I'm scheduling this for the second reading on February 25th. But there's an ordinance attached, and I asked for the commissioner's approval to go ahead with the purchase of these mining claims. or the
Rachel?
interest, the mineral interest in the mining claims.
Now, I understand that we had gone down to the auction with the city of Aspen as well.
Correct.
Are they assisting and sharing in the purchase price?
Yes, they're paying for 50% of it, and we will hold the mineral interest jointly with the city of Aspen. So the total to the county is 18,700.
You know, I would like to move forward with this. I think both the city, the county, and all our residents have tremendous amount of investment in the open space on Smuggler Mountain, and it may just be a small insurance policy, but I think it's well worth it. So
Exactly.
I'm happy to move forward with this.
Patty?
Yeah, I did receive a comment, well, just in passing on the street from someone who questioned why we would be interested in these mineral rights when the chances of somebody mining up there. And I explained to them my understanding that you never know when somebody might come in and want to at some point in the future and show interest in mining there and maybe hold the county hostage to that for preservation of this incredible piece of open space that we worked so hard to purchase for so many years. And so I kind of swung them into realizing what a great opportunity this was for the county. And I want to thank Open Space for going down and going to the auction, which I can imagine must have been interesting. And I'm totally in support of this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Michael?
Matt or John, if we were to decide, and this is just a theoretical question, if we were to decide not to go ahead with the purchase of these, what would be the, since they're already purchased, what would be the procedure?
We would be out the money that was bid at the auction, but we would not accept title without the ordinance of the board.
And so
It would still be available for the estate to convey to somebody else.
okay.
Matt, on the map, the parts over to the left side that don't have the mining claim names on them that are in the red, is that open space land that, does the red depict open space land?
Yes, the red depicts open space land.
And the mining claim part is only the parts with the names on them?
Yes, with the yellow. Those were the ones that were owned by Ed Smart's estate.
Okay, so then the other parts over to the left, is that the part that was owned by Wilkinson?
I believe
The
so.
county acquired that in a previous transaction?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Right, George?
Accept the motion.
Yes.
I would make a motion to approve the authorization of the Smuggler Mountain Minerals open space acquisition.
Second?
Okay, it's been moved in a second and seconded to approve this acquisition. Is there any further comments? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay,
Thank you.
thank you,
Thanks,
Matt.
Thanks a lot.
Next, we have a resolution for an IGA with the state of Colorado for the congestion mitigation air quality grant. And we have two people here.
Yes. Introductions. Brian Pettit, I'm the Public Works Director, and I'm here with Jonah Frank, who's our Fleet Manager. This item's come in front of the board a few times in work session, and at least from a majority of the board standpoint was conceptually approved to move forward. And this is to purchase 3 fully electric vehicles that are short range in nature and install 2 charging stations at Public Works through the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Grant Program that the FHWA and CDOT administers and divvies out to the City of Aspen and Pitkin County in alternate years. So that is our recommendation at this time, and we're ready to move forward with the state and purchase the 3 vehicles and install 2 charging stations.
George?
So Brian, did we ever get a cost estimate in terms of what each of these vehicles will be running us?
We have, and I think in previous work sessions we distributed a cost comparison between gasoline vehicles and fully electric vehicles, but maybe Jonah has some more recent information based on state bid results.
The state hasn't posted all of their bid results yet. They still have a few lingering contracts to work out the details on. The pricing will be under $30,000 a piece for the vehicles, from what I've been able to gather from the state and just local vendors.
The other question I have is each charging station has the capability of charging up to 4 electric vehicles, correct?
2. It's 2 charging stations and 4 total.
So each charging station can only charge 2 vehicles?
Correct.
Okay, I misread that.
Patty?
So, and the city has charging stations behind City Hall, is that correct? I mean, there's some in town, so if we were to drive these vehicles from Public Works into town, we can plug them in while you guys are working in town or whatever we need to be doing.
Yes, that and the range of the vehicles, they won't need to be plugged in for short trips. I mean, they can go to Glenwood and back
Oh, okay.
without being charged.
And then the charging stations at Public Works, I'm going to reiterate this again for the public, are available for public use. If, for instance, their county vehicle wasn't being charged or had been fully charged, somebody from North 40 could bring their electric vehicle over, or somebody who was coming up into Aspen could charge their vehicle, jump on the bus, and come to town, for example. Is that right? They will be available to the public.
That's correct.
Perfect.
I was curious, where at Public Works, are you going to have one charging station on each level of the parking there, or are they both going to be on the same level, or what?
We're looking at the lot up above for both charging stations. I think to have them in close proximity is going to be more efficient economically because we have to run
For the installation.
the utility to that place.
And I had been thinking that we were replacing 3 vehicles or not purchasing 3 gas vehicles with this, but then in reading through the packet, I realized that basically we're replacing privately owned cars that are running county trips now is what's happening a lot. So in effect, we are replacing gasoline-powered vehicles with ones that run on the electricity.
Absolutely.
It's just not county vehicles, it's the privately owned vehicles.
And in some cases, it is a county vehicle that is going to be sold, but it's being driven for county purposes. So this is not going to add vehicle trips, it's going to replace existing gasoline vehicles.
Eventually then we'll reduce the total number of vehicles down to 3 vehicles.
Absolutely, if that's the case.
Okay. Rachel?
Yeah, I just would comment that these are part of a much larger fleet for county service employees to be doing, whether it's your drive to CCI for this weekend, my drive to CCI for this weekend. And I was looking at the Traverse the other day, and I know we didn't buy it that long ago, and it's encroaching on 90,000 miles. And, that it just really adds up fast. So I don't know that we will be reducing our overall fleet numbers as our workload and service demands continue to grow. And I want to make sure there's no false impression out there about that. I do think that, as Michael suggested at the last meeting, to the extent we can reduce miles, all the better for our employees. But to the extent we're not able to, I think it's good that we're moving into an electric vehicle.
George? Michael and then George.
But let me get this straight, Brian. I've had objections to this whole thing previously. I won't go over them. But this is an agreement with the state to accept the grant. This is separate from, right? We've agreed to supply $34,000. The state's agreed to supply $165,000. There's no specification for what we buy in this.
There is a specification of the program. We have approval from the state and the federal government.
But this is an agreement to accept that grant.
That's correct.
This is not about the particulars. This is about
the grant. The grant distribution is predicated on purchasing 3 electric vehicles and installing 2 charging stations.
right. But there's no information in the documents supplied in front of us about any of that.
I understand. And before the state were to sign this grant, they would want to know what the money's being used for.
Right.
Actually, the federal government wants to know what the money's being used for.
Right.
So we wouldn't have this opportunity had we not had a program to suggest or to propose.
Okay.
You are correct, though, Michael. It doesn't specify the EV program that we're talking about.
George?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Would you accept a motion?
I have one more question. Let me ask you. Is the state purchasing a large number of electric vehicles and we will go in on like a purchasing?
That's what we're hoping for, Yes.
So that way we could get a discount, a volume kind of a discount and get a better price, if that works out.
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Rachel.
I would move to approve a resolution to enter into an intergovernmental agreement with the state of Colorado for a congestion mitigation air quality grant.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the resolution for the IGA. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed?
I'm going to oppose it for reasons that I've stated previously.
Okay. Motion passed. Thank you.
Thanks.
I look forward to seeing that. Are we gonna have a little
Little demo?
sticker on them or something that says
Oh, yeah.
EV or something?
We could certainly look into doing something like that.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Thanks. Let's get you.
And Brian, you can just stay there. Next, we have an ordinance approving the purchase of Pitkin Park Place Unit 417A for the county employee housing inventory.
Yes, and
Brian?
this unit has come to the board before, and we are recommending the purchase of this 2-bedroom, 1-bath unit in the AABC area. It appraised for $369,000 in July, and the county has a contract price of $325,000 to purchase the unit and add it to our existing inventory for county employees and for employees at large in Pitkin County.
I have a question.
Patty?
And you may have discussed this at some time in the past about when you were discussing this property. I know there's been issues out in the AABC about homeowners associations where you're going in with housing authority properties and free market properties. Is this going to be an issue for this unit, or are we clear on that?
Say it again, Patty. Yeah.
I think she's talking about when the units have become too expensive because homeowners trying to gentrify the larger complex, and then the share would be.
Well, the dues, yeah, when you're talking a housing authority unit in a free market complex, and you have a homeowners association, there's been some issues that come up about affordability.
So one of the ways that we've addressed that, Patty, is for the portfolio of units that the county is putting together, we're actually not deed restricting those units, but we're offering them at the affordability guidelines as rental units. So
Okay, got it.
if there were a situation where it were to become excessive, we have the ability to offload that and put the funds back into the housing program or into our housing fund for another unit. Frankly, in looking at the HOA financials and their history, we do have another unit like this right now. We're not concerned about that, but if something were to change in the future, we have the ability to let that unit go without the deed
And the money
restriction.
come back in the fund. Okay, that's all I needed to know. Thank you. But you're right, Rachel, it's the affordability issue.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Brian, on the units that the county has purchased up to date, how are those units being used?
It's a good question. I'm just recalling in my mind. I do believe we're very close to a 50-50 split between all of the units. We have 5 currently, so we can't be completely that way. But
Yeah, 1.5 and a half.
it's very close, and I think this one would it would be offered to the community based on our current the current occupancy.
And we have some of those turning over right now, and the board set a goal of the 50-50 split. And what we were doing is designating those up front. And what we found was the need didn't come in those exact 50-50 splits. And so we've been working with APSHA and based on our current mix to either offer units as community or offer them to our employees. If we don't have qualified employees, they're going into the community mix. And then the next one that comes vacant, we'll bring back and offer to our employees. But we've been roughly keeping about a 50-50. And sometimes it flips between whether it's our employees or community.
Okay. And have the employees who have been in units been happy with the ones they've had and the locations and
Absolutely.
their commute and all those sorts of things?
Yes. Yeah. This is a successful program. It's working even in the slow growth that we're having with the purchases.
Okay. Rachel?
Yeah, I think that this is another good acquisition at a reasonable price, given the real estate prices in our community. And I know we had discussed before as a board that when we do get ready to rent them, we naturally do a little bit of cleaning up, rehab, things like that, but that we also do energy efficiency tests on them to make sure they're as energy efficient as we're able to make them for older units. So given that, I would make a motion to approve the ordinance approving the purchase of Pitkin Park Place Unit 417A for the Pitkin County Employee Housing Inventory and authorizing the execution of the necessary documents.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded to approve the ordinance. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay,
Thank you.
thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Moving on to public hearings, second readings. The first one is a resolution establishing the formula for the distribution of the municipal share of county sales tax. And Susan's here to answer if we have any more questions on this.
So do you?
Introduce yourself, Susan.
Okay,
just
I'm
for the
Susan
public's
Atwood.
benefit.
I'm with the Finance Department. This ordinance is about dividing up the 2% sales tax that the state collects for the county per an ordinance in, I think, 1978 that says we divide it between the towns of Basalt, Snowmass Village, and Aspen. And how we divide it or determine the division is we compare 1% collections from each entity and then divvy up the 2% based on that. We get 43% regardless. It's only the 57% that changes each year.
The only
Okay.
question I have, are there any changes from first reading to today?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Public hearing?
This is a public hearing. Do any members of the public wish to comment on this? Okay, hearing none, I close the public hearing.
I would make a motion to approve the resolution establishing the formula for distribution of the municipal share of the county's sales tax revenue for the year 2015 as required by Resolution 78-121.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Next is an ordinance authorizing an amendment to different sections of the county code regulating the licensing of retail and medical marijuana establishments in caucus areas. And John Ely will give a brief description of this for us.
All right, Steve, this is the second reading and public hearing on an ordinance that would amend both sets of county regulations concerning the licensing of marijuana establishments. The ordinance is in the same condition as was initially proposed and accepted by the board on first reading a couple of weeks ago. The board has established, and the county has currently, two different sets of marijuana regulations. One that pertains to medical marijuana and one that pertains to retail marijuana. And that demarcation is probably the beginning of the confusion in that medical marijuana is pretty straightforward and it is exactly what the name implies. Retail, though, does not concern itself with the actual sale of marijuana or marijuana products, but concerns itself with the licensing of any marijuana establishment that deals with something other than medical marijuana. As the regulations and statutes have evolved at the state level, they've been embedded within it some differing degrees of confusion, I think, in the terminology that's used. At any rate, the county's retail marijuana licensing regulations were adopted a year ago tomorrow. When they were adopted, embedded within the regulations were recommendations by several caucuses for the prohibition of different types of marijuana licensing activity. The board at that time determined to accept the recommendations of the caucuses, but wanted to review those prohibitions in 1 year's time. When the county adopted or amended its earlier adopted medical marijuana licenses last summer, the same, or the prohibitions that were recommended in that regard from the various caucuses that submitted those recommendations were grafted into those regulations and also set to sunset consistent with the retail marijuana regulations tomorrow. So the county attorney's office contacted the various caucuses and asked if there was a change from the earlier positions and recommendations, or if they wanted to communicate anything in addition. We received comments from all of the essentially the Down Valley caucus areas, the Snowmass Cap caucus, the Upper Frying Pan, Woody Creek, the Crystal River, and Emma. None of the other caucus areas within the proximity, more or less, to the city of Aspen have weighed in, and that probably is because we have not received any requests from any potential licensees for any type of marijuana activity in those areas. Pursuant to the regulations that have been adopted by the county, if we were to receive any type of application for a marijuana activity in those areas, the regulations provide that those caucuses would be contacted specifically for any recommendation. When the recommendations of the caucuses were grafted in the original regulations, it was done for a couple of different reasons. First, it would save any potential licensee a lot of time and a lot of money trying to essentially obtain a license in an area that more than likely was going to be denied based upon a recommendation of community members, and also save the various caucuses the time and effort from having to respond to any number of application requests that might come in. So we're here to review the prohibitions that relate to the various caucus areas and to adopt those into the two different sets of regulations. What appears within the ordinance for consideration and adoption today tracks those recommendations. Briefly, there is a request that the marijuana licensed activity, either retail or marijuana, be prohibited in the Frying Pan Caucus and the Woody Creek Caucus outright, and those prohibitions have been grafted into the proposed regulations. There was not an ability for Emma to weigh in. Their caucus will not have a chance to discuss this at depth until after February 12th, when the prohibition would expire. However, Emma previously recommended and requested from the board that no marijuana licenses be issued, either retail or marijuana, and so that earlier request has been carried forward, basically because there's been no action or indication that that earlier request would be modified. So a complete prohibition in those three caucuses, tracking the recommendations and requests received from those caucus areas. In Snowcap, the earlier recommendation was for no retail marijuana license activities and for no medical marijuana cultivation activities. I think the distinction there was because the original medical marijuana regulations preceded the retail marijuana regulations, and Snowcap caucus believed at the time that the only marijuana activity that would be considered for licensing consistent with the zoning in that area would be for cultivation. I think that assumption was erroneous because you can have other licensed activities in the form of home occupations that could legitimately occur under county zoning. So to make their recommendations consistent with the way the law lines out and the way the county's regulations read, we've proposed for adoption a complete prohibition of licensed activities in Snowcap as well. The board of Snowmass Capital Caucus, as opposed to a general membership, has expressed that desire, so that is consistent with the board at least. As far as the Crystal River Caucus, there had been previously a recommendation against any retail marijuana licenses or the expansion of any or the issuance of any retail marijuana licenses that were new or not related to an already existing licensed establishment, as well as a prohibition within the village area, the VC zoned area, village commercial, of any medical marijuana store or retail establishment. The caucus has changed their recommendation to relate only to the village of Redstone and to retract its earlier recommendation and request for an absolute prohibition within the caucus area as a whole. However, when expressed, they conveyed that in an email, simply stating to keep the prohibition against medical marijuana licensing in the town of Redstone in place, to make that also consistent and I think truer with their underlying recommendation, at least as expressed and acknowledged by one of the caucus members. We've drafted the proposed regulations to prohibit any marijuana licensing within the village commercial zone district, which is essentially the village of Redstone. The other item of note I would mention is that previously, when the board accepted recommendations from the caucus areas, we had set a one-year time to sunset those prohibitions for the board to consider those prohibitions anew, which is, of course, what we're doing here today. The proposed regulations do not contain a sunset provision, and so those prohibitions will survive until the board changes them, either on the county's own initiative or on a recommendation from the affected caucus area. Okay. That is it.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned, I'm very concerned actually, that we're now letting caucuses drive county regulations. Caucuses were formed for advisory positions, to advise the county on issues within their jurisdiction, but not to drive particular legislation for particular caucuses. And so the trend now has been, we're going to have a particular zoning for house size in a particular caucus, and now we're going to have a particular regulation for marijuana in a particular caucus. So the tail is now wagging the dog. So you have a 75% majority of the county voting for marijuana regulations. The response to that in these caucuses has been, well, it was somebody else. It was the city of Aspen. It was the 75% that doesn't exist here in my caucus. Well, I mean, you might be able to buy that reasoning. I can't buy that reasoning. So, and then in the recommendations from the caucuses, we gave them a year of consideration, which I think is a fair thing to do. Tell us why you don't want marijuana cultivation or whatever in your caucus. And none of the caucuses gave any reason except, no, we don't want it. So there's no reasoned explanation of why they don't want it. No one says, well, it'll have an effect on the values of my property. It'll have an effect on my neighborhood. I won't be able to cattle ranch any longer because there'll be too many cultivation of marijuana areas. I mean, there's just nothing here. So there's no reasoning for why we should ban it. It's not just, I don't like it, I don't want it. So that's thin, if you ask me. After a year, after 365 days, no more than I still don't want it, that's not very good. So I don't really approve of this. I can't really support it because we're getting into treating the caucuses as if they were a principality, as if they were their own little holding with their own laws, their own regulations that are different from the counties. The county is small enough that I just can't see having different regulations in different particular areas. I just can't see it. if it should be good enough for the whole county. And I would suggest to you that we can have another moratorium for a year, I can see that, and ask for particular reasons why cultivation, why retail marijuana isn't good for these. Give us specific reasons. But I think when we pass legislation here, it should be for the entire county. And this is not for the entire county. And if we keep going down this road, we're going to have principalities throughout the county that want their own way of doing things. It just doesn't make sense. Now, I can understand why people are concerned, but they're going to have to work at telling me what those concerns are. And none of the letters here reflect any work to that effect. So I would suggest to you that we drop back, give a year moratorium, go to the caucuses, say, be substantive about your objections, because we intend to pass legislation that covers the entire county, not small portions of the county, and leave it at that.
Patty?
Yeah, you know, Michael, that's a really good point. And I think when we go back to looking at when we first started to develop caucus master plans with house size, we did, and I still support that, address with specific legislation based on specific caucuses. But we did it with a lot of discussion and a lot of input from those caucuses as to why they wanted house size of X or house size of Y or TDRs or no TDRs. And I support that. I am concerned about, I truly believe in caucus input. I encourage it and want the public and the caucuses to bring forth their comments. But they are recommending bodies to this board of elected officials. We were elected to make the decisions. Doesn't mean we have to disagree with them all the time. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them all the time. It just means that we have to take into consideration their comments and the work they put into bringing those comments forth to us for our review and our consideration. And believe it or not, Michael, I agree with you on the one-year moratorium. I think that what's it going to hurt to bring it back again? Things are changing and evolving in this industry. Things may change. I don't think it's going to hurt. If anything, it may help. And I agree that the caucuses, I don't have a problem with them bringing back some concrete explanations and some real reasons why they don't specifically want, or why we should treat them differently. I don't, though, agree with the fact that we need to have universal marijuana regulations. I think we can be specific to specific areas based on their specific comments and their specific needs. So thank you, Michael, for bringing that forward.
Rachel?
Thank you. I feel like this is a legitimate action today, and I don't think that governing by moratorium makes sense. You know, we have heard what the caucuses have had to say to date, and I do agree that it's an important role to recall the advisory nature of caucuses, but I don't want to reject their opinions because they may be protective of their backyard or concerned about their neighborhoods. I think those are legitimate. I think that given the whole newness of recreational marijuana legalization in the state of Colorado and how the rules continue to change at the state level, that it makes sense for any group of citizens to want to move cautiously. And I think that what I would like to do, if anything, on this, is to go ahead and reinstate that it would sunset after 3 years, and it would therefore come back to our board for review after 3 years. It would mostly be this seated board for the most part, and we could see how well they're working. But I'd rather govern under rules that express what we know today than govern via a moratorium. And that's supposed to be a very temporary tool until you enact your legislation, as opposed to, yes, let's continue it and knowing that it's very likely the regulations would come out to be a lot like this. I mean, you have to have an end point and you have to do work for a moratorium. I've said before, it's very a large tool to use a moratorium, and you can create an awful lot of pent-up demand, you know, in that time period, and then you're kind of reacting to the pent-up demand then as opposed to the original issue. So again, I think that this has been hashed out, and whether it's fear of the unknown or whatever, I do take those concerns seriously. I don't think the current Pickens County regulations have done anything to inhibit the commerce that some people are choosing to embark on within the municipalities. The state laws have changed so that you don't have to have the vertical integration, that you have to sell grow 70% of what you sell. You could buy it at a wholesale level now. And so it's less critical that someone have both a shop and a grow facility in some sort of proximity. And so I'm just willing to respect the work that's been done so far. I've not seen bad problems come up, and I think that this is reasonable. But I think that if we reinstate the 3-year review, it will bring the issue back to this board, and there can be further requests to ask caucuses, have minds changed, are opinions different, and as we've seen more of the state regulation truly take hold. So I'm comfortable moving this forward today, but I would like to reinstate that review if that would help bring people along to know that it's not these codes forever.
I just need to respond really quickly to
Yeah,
Rachel.
please.
Please, I don't want anybody to think that I am rejecting caucus opinions. I am not doing that. I respect caucus opinions. I just think that I'm leaning towards supporting Michael's position. And I know the M word, the moratorium word, is a tough word, and in this case, I don't have a problem. We may have in 3 years a totally different board sitting here, just other than you and I. We don't know, the wish of the voters. So, things may change, and it's not to say that the next board wouldn't support this, but I'm kind of leaning more in Michael's direction, but I do appreciate Rachel's positions.
Yeah, if I could make a real short one, I mean, the very next item we're going to cover, the special event codes, has different codes in different zones, in different areas, so that's kind of where I'm at as well.
George?
Yeah, I mean, there's two issues here for me. One, which has been expressed, is how do we view caucus's recommendations? Do we look at them as within their individual neighborhoods, or do we take their information but then try to do a broad blanket approach in terms of legislation? And for that, I would agree that caucuses are set up as advisory on land use issues that impact their neighborhood specifically. And that's what the caucuses have done. They've given us their advisory recommendations. If you're interested in knowing reasons why, Michael, there are minutes that each of these caucuses have kept in their discussions. I haven't forwarded them on, but I'm sure they're available online, in fact, of the discussions that have taken place. Woody Creek, we heard from Woody Creek loud and clear with many different reasons why they did not want to have a growth site in their neighborhood. They didn't express them in a written form for this resolution, but we've heard that before. So I would accept the recommendations of the caucuses and respect their views, certainly on this matter, and we've respected their views on other matters, as has been expressed in terms of house sizes. And I suspect we're going to hear different views upcoming on special events regulations and other issues that impact each individual caucus. If you want uniformity, I would recommend that we just prohibit recreational licensing throughout the county, unincorporated Pickens County. Because frankly, wherever it shows up in unincorporated Pickens County, we're going to have citizens that would oppose it. The municipalities, the town of Snowmass Village does not allow any licensing. And that's a municipality where probably a large part of those votes in terms of passing that legislation came from. So I think we should be looking at this from a recommendation of the caucuses, and I would still say we don't need a sunset. As Patty said, boards will change. In general, neighborhood caucus residents are there for long term. They're not switching every 3 or 4 years to have new neighborhoods and new members of the caucuses. But they're long term. Commissioners sit here on a short term basis. So caucuses have the ability to make changes as they see fit. If legislation changes or they find that for some reason there are not as impactful as they may have thought initially. So they have the ability to do that. And as I said earlier, I suspect that many caucuses will have some wording in their updated master plan specifically addressing marijuana that will then go before the P&Z, and if the P&Z approves it, then that becomes part of the land use. So I would say that let caucuses make the determination if we want to accept their recommendations, which I do.
This is a public hearing. Are there any members of the public who would wish to speak at this time? Nancy.
I'm Nancy McKenzie, and I'm representing the Woody Creek Caucus. And I want to thank George. I appreciate what you just said, and I think that's the feeling of our caucus. And we had discussed this a year ago with all the details that Michael was saying we didn't present in requesting what you're looking at right now. But we had many members at that meeting way back when we did the moratorium. So I hope you will remember what those were. We didn't relist them all again. We didn't think that was necessary. But we want to preserve the rural nature of Woody Creek. We don't want big grow barns. You've seen the one on Highway 82 just outside of Basalt. That thing is huge, causes a lot more traffic. And we still are residential. And we kind of figure that those buildings are commercial. And they don't belong in our residential areas. Thank you.
Are there any other comments from members of the public? Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. Rachel?
Steve, I would like to make a motion to begin the discussion and get a motion on the table. I would move to approve the ordinance of the Board of County Commissioners authorizing amendment to sections 6.48.070C 16 and 6.49.070 C15 and 16 of the Pickens County Code regulating the licensing of retail and medical marijuana establishments in caucus areas, including to be amended for a 3-year review, 3-year sunset of this regulations. And I don't know if there's a second.
I will second it.
Okay. I suppose I'm trying to find a middle ground here between those who feel they should be enacted forever and never really reviewed again, or who would like to see a moratorium and then a full review in a year from now. I just see this as middle ground and an ability to move forward.
I guess it's a sort of a more example, I know, but why wouldn't we have, or previous boards review house sizes in terms of recommendations from different caucuses? And I don't understand why we were reviewing some aspects, but not other aspects.
Well, I would see it as related to state law more than anything, George, that this is a state law that allows this and that communities will be potentially changing over time as to whether they allow, disallow, things like that. I don't see house size as being something that was created by state law and changed by state law. So that's part of why I see it a little differently. I just think, again, there's a lot of newness to this whole program. There's a lot of reaction one way or the other. And I think that people need to feel there's a little bit of consistency out there, that they don't have to worry about this cloud hanging over them because it's going to come back every year. I mean, there's something to be said for, it's status quo now for a year, but who knows what those guys will do in a year. And this tells everybody this is what we're doing and that we can look for legitimate reasons to change it. I think it's important to have a review of something that's this new. You know, people have been building houses here in one form or another for a long, long time. And if this board wanted to bring up house sizes and begin to discuss that again, we just need a majority interested in doing that. But that's I just see this as a way to move this forward, institutionalize what we have going already, create a kind of a worry-free environment for a while to be able to evaluate things like this, but not set a hurdle so high that someone would have to get their individual caucus alone to support maybe their application to come in to amend a code that's on the books for perpetuity with no sunset. A sunset will require there be new consideration. and I think it's valuable to have new consideration after a little time has passed.
Patty?
Did you want to respond to that? I was going to.
You can go.
Yeah, I think Rachel presents a good argument. The compromise, I'm going to move in that direction. And she is right. We can bring back anything we want from any caucus, any decision we've made with the majority of the board. And the House size has come up many times over the years after we've said it. Should we make it more strict? Should we relax it in any individual caucus area? So I think it's fair, and Rachel is right based on state laws, and this ever-changing. This is kind of a living document. And so I'm going to go in that direction. Thank you, Rachel, for your good arguments.
George?
John Ely, if different caucuses, as they're updating their master plans, write in those master plans specifically prohibiting any marijuana licensing in their caucus areas, and that gets approved by the P&Z, then does that override this ordinance?
No.
So,
The P&Z is not a legislating body. The P&Z makes some decisions that are ultimate, for example, the adoption of a master plan. But this is an action that is not directly land use related, but is directly related to the issuance of a license. And as such, it's embedded in these two regulations dealing with marijuana licensing. And the only body that has control over those regulations is the BOCC.
Michael?
Yeah, you know, the board passed an agricultural structures program, which allowed for larger agricultural buildings than we normally, at least in the past, allowed. And part of that was a concern for agriculture, right? Comes along an agricultural pursuit, which is the growing of marijuana. So you actually have the conjunction of two activities, cultivation of marijuana and larger structures. They combine. You could do it. The caucuses, I know there have been lots of discussions. I've been present for some of them. But they haven't said anything other than, I don't like marijuana cultivation. That isn't, that's, I don't like automobiles. I'm not suggesting we ban automobiles in Pickens County. So you just have to work harder to say the negative effects of the cultivation of marijuana include pesticide use, agricultural pests, odors, whatever people, and that's why we don't want it. That's what I'm asking for. There's a lot of things that individuals don't like that we don't ban. It's just you'll survive. And I think the county would survive the cultivation of marijuana. As long as I've been here, people have been saying, gosh, I wish we could grow something that made money, that we could export, that we could be as proud of as people were as proud of the thousands of tons of potatoes that they exported out of this county. But as long as I've been here, they haven't been able to come up with a solution for that. There's been some cattle ranching, but that's it. So now comes an agricultural possibility that we're banning. That doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't make sense. It allows people to use their land in a way that's productive and profitable. Then now there may be impacts to a neighborhood, in which case we can say those impacts override that cultivation. And we would do that, for instance, if it was a turkey farm in a residential neighborhood. We'd say, listen, there's so many negatives to this turkey farm that we're just not going to allow it in this proximity to this, and that's what we would do. And we might do it with marijuana cultivation. So I think that bringing it back to sort of a common sense level of what are the impacts, what harm does it do, or does it do harm, That's what we should judge it on. And what this reflects, and what the caucus reflects, is, for me at least, a fear of newness, a fear of the future, a fear of something I don't know anything about, which is understandable. I can understand that. But you have to document it. You have to tell me why. And that's all I was suggesting by a year moratorium. Whether it's a sunset or a moratorium, it doesn't really matter to me. The 3 years is a good alternative to that. What I'm trying to say is, let's have a higher standard of why we don't like things within our caucuses. Let's judge those and see if there's space to face the future.
Steve, could I just have for a point?
No,
There's no reason if we do this and move it forward for a 3-year sunset that we could bring it back. We could bring it back anytime we wanted to, couldn't we? We didn't have to wait 3 years. So in a year, if the laws changed or public support differed or whatever, we could bring it back in a week.
That's correct.
Much to your demise, but we could bring it back in a week.
Not a problem.
Okay.
The problem with that is being able to have caucuses have the opportunity in a timely manner to respond. And that was one of the reasons that the Emma caucus was not able to respond, because they didn't have a meeting set for this time period. So, you know, I'm not going to fall on my sword on this. 3 years we would have to reach out to the caucuses, let them know that we want to have their input again. Hopefully that next sitting board will be as considerate as this board has been in terms of respecting caucuses' opinions, but you don't know. That's just up to the electorate, I guess, in terms of who they want to represent them.
Okay, I'm going to weigh in now, and I would support Rachel's 3-year sunset provision to this. A 1-year thing is, I think, would be too fast. The current ordinance expires tomorrow. You know, 1 year went by really quickly, and we had, you know, caucuses were struggling to have a meeting before the time came out. A 3-year sunset provision allows for several things to happen. One, the landscape on the national level and the state level is constantly changing. Just in the last year, 2 more states have approved legalized recreational marijuana, Alaska and Oregon. Washington, D.C. also approved it, but Congress has a veto power over that. So the national scene is changing. I think eventually marijuana will be legalized across the whole United States. The scene in Colorado is definitely changing with, you know, adjusting the laws where things are still being tweaked, and we don't know quite what the end result will be from all the different changes, but it is still a new industry. Jordan Lewis's greenhouse down in the Holland Hills area has just recently been completed, and we don't really have feedback on. People drive by it and see it, but I haven't gotten any feedback from any neighbors or people directly involved with it. But I would note that the one grow operation on the Crystal River, which is Jordan Lewis's also, and that caucus decided to allow recreational or retail marijuana in their caucus area outside of Redstone, and they're the ones that have a grow operation there already. So I think that says something that they haven't had any impacts from that operation that were so much that the people didn't want to approve any further ones. So I really like, in the long run, I would like the whole county to go the direction the Crystal River Caucus is going. And in their email, they mention that they would like to consider each application on a case-by-case basis. And I think that's where we will be eventually sometime down the road, perhaps after, you know, who knows how long this whole transition will take place, but that's where I would like to be eventually. Right now, I remember that more than 75% of the voters in every precinct in Picken County approved Amendment 64. Every single precinct was more than 75%. Marijuana's been being grown and used in Picken County for at least the last half century, if not longer. It's not like it's a new thing here, but I do respect the caucuses. You know, 3 of us here are product of the caucus system, being in a caucus and then ending up on the Board of County Commissioners. So I really respect the caucus's wishes, and there is still so much uncertainty out there that I want to respect their wishes, and, you know, like, give an extension, and if it's a 3-year extension on what we did a year ago, that, to me, that would be fine, and we could always come back and change it. I don't want to just put an indefinite thing, though, that we don't have any reason to come back and revisit it. Having the 3-year limit will force us to come back and look at it in 3 years and see. I think the landscape will be different in 3 years, and we might well, you know, come up with something different at that time.
Steve, I just want to add to your thing about caucuses. The public may have forgotten, but when I first ran for office, it was based on the Smuggler Mountain Caucus and our efforts with Superfund. And one of the reasons that I decided to run for office was because of my frustration with the entire Board of County Commissioners not listening to the comments of the public, of the voting public. And so I take that truly to heart. And when the caucuses go, and we worked really hard at Smuggler for bringing forward our concerns, and we were not listened to. So I keep that in mind whenever I hear caucus or neighborhood input.
And also Michael's comments about agriculture and
Right.
This being a high value crop that it could keep some ranches able to operate,
Let's
provide
grow some
enough
hemp.
income.
Let's bring that hemp in here.
Or hemp.
In the ground.
Hemp would be the same thing. I would include hemp in that.
Yeah.
We now have people growing potatoes to make vodka in Picken County, and vodka's probably way worse for people than marijuana. So, anyhow, I would support, for those reasons, I would support Rachel's motion with the amendment with a 3-year sunset. John?
If I could suggest some exact wording to the maker, Rachel, and the seconder, Steve, that a new paragraph 17 would be added to the retail marijuana regulations, and a new paragraph 16 added to the medical marijuana regulations that would read exactly as follows. The prohibition on the issuance of licenses as described above shall remain in place until February 15, 2018.
That would be acceptable to the maker of the motion.
Me too.
Okay.
I guess somehow the staff will have to keep a tickler file to allow adequate time to communicate to the caucuses.
Notice the caucuses.
When that deadline is approaching.
Yeah, I think
However you do that.
Yeah.
They have a tickler file.
Yeah, most of the caucuses are in possession of a calendar, so I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think that puts a lot of onus on caucuses, which we're all volunteers.
Okay. If it would help, I would further amend the motion to include that staff will notify the individual caucuses 1 year prior to the expiration of the sunset of this ordinance, so they can begin soliciting feedback for its review.
I would suggest that putting that in the ordinance is
Unnecessary.
Makes the reg kind of complicated, but you can certainly just
Direct staff.
direct staff. which
Okay,
is-
let's leave it out of the motion, it's just, but I agree with George's point. Okay.
It's been moved and seconded to approve the ordinance with the modification of the 3-year sunset provision. Is there any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed?
Rachel, good. There we go. Good job.
Thank you. The final public hearing item is resolution approving a memorandum of understanding with the Colorado State Health Department for PM10 monitoring. And Kurt Dahl is here from, I was going to say from Public Works, but that's just where your
Public
office is.
Public Environmental Health, yep. Good afternoon. I have for second reading, memorandum of understanding with the State Health Department Air Pollution Control Division for my department to operate the PM10 monitors that are now on the roof of the Yellow Brick Building. In the late 80s, the Aspen area was listed in non-attainment of the ambient air quality standard for PM10. PM10 are particulate matter, coarse particulate matter, that are 10 micrometers or down to 2.5 micrometers. And then there's a fine particulate matter that is designated separately, that's PM 2.5, and that's 2.5 micrometers and smaller. The county and the city both enacted several sets of regulations to come back into compliance with this standard. We encouraged limited vehicle driving in the area. We encouraged public transportation, bicycle use. We both have regulations on wood burning appliances in the area. And we have regulations that address controlling fugitive dust on construction sites. So a number of things that we did to bring that back down into compliance. And in 2003, the EPA actually designated us as in attainment, but also as a maintenance area, which means that we have to continue to monitor to ensure we're still in compliance with that standard. As part of that, there are high-volume monitors, filters, that we previously had on the roof of the library that sample the air every 3 days, and those filters are then sent to the State Health Department, who has an agreement with the EPA for this program. And the PM10 monitor levels are checked every 3 days over a year period to ensure we're in compliance. The monitors themselves were moved this summer when the library was re-roofed. There were some concerns about leaving them on top of the library, so they've been moved now to the roof of the Yellow Brick Building. And they're there with the City of Aspen has a what's called a real-time monitor, which actually shows the samples. There are various samples, including PM10, that it takes, and it's in real time, and they have that information displayed. That's one of the things that there seems to be some confusion about. The monitors that we're talking about that my department is proposing to run are just high-volume samplers that are an approved EPA sampler that are there for just the compliance for PM10. What the city has is a real-time monitor, and at this point, even though technicians would tell you that probably is more accurate than the samplers we're using, it hasn't been certified for these measurements by the EPA, so they can't use that for compliance purposes, and so that's why we're still continuing to run these samplers. The samples themselves, the MOU with the state, there's a small amount of revenue associated with it. It's not something that's going to cover the cost completely, but the work itself actually is pretty minimal too. We're talking about 2 samplers, and so my staff or myself, me or Brian, would probably be on the roof 1 or 2 days a week. One of the things that was a concern that we discussed last time was we're not actually accessing the building to get to the roof. The ladder is on the outside of the building. It's locked. We have a key so that we can actually open the, it's just a door that actually covers part of the ladder, so it's not accessible. So there were some discussion about security pieces. So I think with that.
Okay. Thank you, Kurt.
Did we mention anything at the first read about asking the city to help with compensation, or did we, was that brought up, or did we decide that we didn't need to do that?
You know, I thought on a $1,400 item, we kind
We're
of
okay.
backed away on that. It's consistent with our goals. I think it's, we took it as kind of a broader discussion though, is, you know, these types of partnerships may be available that we look at sharing those with the city. But this item was so small, I think the discussion was we might be spending more in the approval process than we
I just wanted to make sure we had discussed it and decided one way or the
Also,
other.
the city does run the street
real-time one.
sweepers and
Right.
much more high-cost things that
Well,
are
and it may be,
contribute to.
in the future, when EPA realizes that the real-time monitors are actually more efficient, that they just switch over to that. So who knows what will happen with science. Perfect.
Michael?
So, Kurt, what's the long-term upshot of this? So we were a non-attainment area. Now we're an attainment area with monitoring attached, is that what the
Correct.
status is? So with further monitoring, would our status then possibly change?
That's a good question. I'm not familiar that there's been a discussion, or if we ever become just an attainment area that isn't required to monitor. I don't believe so. I believe that's something we'll just continue to do, but I don't know absolutely that isn't an option as well. But I know it hasn't been discussed. So.
I can tell you that in working with EPA and attainment and non-attainment areas, it will go on in perpetuity unless, of course, we become an issue of non-attainment again.
Correct.
That's what they're looking for, but we will probably be in the monitoring status. They won't let go of that. I mean, even if we're 100 years of clean air, they will still hang on to that.
The one piece I'm familiar with is the smuggler, and that I do know we
Yeah.
will be doing that forever.
They
That-
like
that we
they
will-
like to keep you
so.
once they got you.
It's a job security issue. I'm reminded of a story of some stairs in England were painted and they put a guard at the bottom to make sure people wouldn't walk on the wet paint. And then years later, the guard's still standing there long after the paint had dried. Nobody could remember why the guard was put there.
That's kind of a
Rachel.
You know, I don't want to belittle the ongoing efforts for clean air. You know, PM10 is caused, major asthma problems, major lung problems for a lot of people. And it would be easy enough for a future council or BOCC to say, let's cut back on that sweet streeping. You know, that's going to, save us X amount in our budget annually. But it would lead to the air quality going down again. I think re-entrained dirt and silt from the roads is our primary consideration here. And so I don't want to joke about public health in that sense, and I'm glad we're monitoring it, and I think it's important that as a community we don't backslide. So I do support this going forward, and I would make a motion for discussion's sake and for the public hearing. I move to approve a resolution approving a memorandum of understanding with the Colorado State Health Department for PM10 monitoring.
I'll second.
Okay, this is a public hearing. Do any members of the public wish to speak on this at this time? Hearing none, I'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the board. Any further points of discussion? I think, Kurt, if you could just keep your eye on the real-time monitoring thing, and at some point, I bet you that we'll be there, and that then would save somebody climbing up on the roof every 3 days. Do you change the filter after each 3 days, so after from one reading, or is it less frequently that it actually has to be changed?
There are 2 units, so we actually change it less frequently. Just depending on the schedule, there are weeks where we'll be up there only 1 day, and then there will be weeks where we'll be up there 2 days, depending on, holidays or weekends and just how the schedule falls. So it's really 15 minutes of work 1 or 2 days a week, so it's pretty minimal.
You can drive the new electric cars in.
Okay. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much.
Did we close the public hearing on the municipal share?
He's been opening it and closing it.
But that's okay.
Okay, next we have an emergency ordinance authorizing the execution of an easement agreement with the city of Aspen. And John Ely, we have your name down on that, and Kathy Chandler is also here for the library, and she might wish to speak on that.
As well as the whole team with Kathy. Do any of you have a great map or survey to show? If not, I'll put up the one from the.
You're good.
See, second.
Okay, this representation is contained within the board's packet and is available online. The easement agreement that runs back and forth, or is proposed to run back and forth between the city and the county, is a written representation, but the easiest way to look at it, I think, is to look at this exhibit. So, as orientation, this arc here is part of the traffic circle on Galena Street, which exists between generally the courthouse and the existing parking garage, and then over from the library. This heavy dark line here represents or contains what represents the property which is currently owned by the city of Aspen and is developed with the parking garage. This heavy dark line here is property that is owned by Pitkin County and is currently developed with the library. The library structure is represented by this outline, which designates the physical condition of the library on the above surface floor, I guess I would say. Not too many years in the past, this entire assemblage of property was owned by Pitkin County. When the community discussion revealed that a parking garage was necessary for tourists and for local businesses as well, it was deemed that this was the best site. I think that at the time the only thing used or only thing present on the site was a stable of sort that was used by T. Lazy for the the carriages and so forth in town. At any rate, after the parking garage was built, the county conveyed this lot to the city so that the city would have ownership of the property on which their parking garage was built. When the county conveyed that interest to the city, it retained for itself this real heavy shaded area as an easement to allow for the future expansion of the library. At the time, the exact expansion wasn't contemplated in exact detail, but it was felt that if the library ever needed to be expanded, this is the place that it would go. And this reserved easement allowed for expansion of the library on top of the roof, essentially, of the existing parking garage. So, where we are now is at a point where the library board has recommended and the county has acted upon the recognized need for a library expansion. The dilemma is that this reserved easement did not line up structurally with the parking garage, which is underneath this roof. And as a consequence, if we were to build this expansion within the easement, we would have to drill down support pillars at least along the outer edge of this area of expansion that would go down all the way down to the bedrock beneath the parking garage, and as a result would cannibalize a number of parking spaces on that end of the parking garage. To avoid that, it's been recognized by the city and the county and respective consultants that the best way to conduct an expansion of the library facility here is to tie it into an existing support wall, which is here. And that support wall is obvious to anybody who goes into the library, especially if you come in on the alley here to enter the parking garage. The ramp goes down here underneath this area of proposed expansion, and the wall that separates the ramp and the parking spaces on either side exists right here. And then the flow of traffic in the parking garage goes like so. So what the city is proposed to convey to the county, and the county staff is recommending for acceptance by the BOCC, is an expansion of this easement. First, it would allow an expansion into this shaded area to tie in the support members of the expansion to the load-bearing wall within the parking garage. That would also occur up here in this little ribbon of space beyond the existing reserved easement, which is, at least at this point, coterminous with the wall of the existing library building. This would allow construction of the expansion to be accomplished without having to put down support pillars through the parking garage, and the entire addition to be constructed by only accessing and invading the roof of the garage itself. In addition, the expansion contemplates windows, quite logically, on this side of the building, so that fenestration would require some setback of any potential redevelopment of the Galena Street Plaza or this plaza area on top of the library garage. So this shaded area represents a light and air easement granted by the city to the county that would not represent an area of additional building potential for the county, but would represent an area of prohibition of any building by the city, so that we can go ahead and construct the library with you know, a window configuration as appropriate. In addition to these easements is a depth easement. The reservation that the county effected when it conveyed this property to the city did not specify any depth down within the parking garage that the easement, this reserved easement, would be conducted, but it is inferred by the language that essentially we're on top of the roof. To allow these support members to be put in here and here, we're going to expand this reservation of easement to allow the county to go down within the parking structure to a depth of about 4 feet, and that is to allow the support beams to tie into this load-bearing wall again. So those are the easement modifications and grants of easement that are proposed from the city to the county. This shaded area here is a proposed grant of easement from the county to the city, and this is on top of the existing sidewalk, which runs down adjacent to this alleyway here, and Mill Street, of course, is right here. This easement underneath the sidewalk is for utility purposes, so the city can install water utilities and electric utilities underneath the sidewalk and then return the sidewalk to its existing situation. This is necessary because underneath the alleyway is a already existing easement that benefits the Aspen Sand District, and it's thought that it's just easier to construct these 2 new utility lines here as opposed to cramming them into the alleyway. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy and Jody and Jim if he wants to weigh in to explain anything further on the easement agreement or answer any questions from the board.
I'm Jody. The only thing that I would add is the depth easement that we're dropping down into the garage 4 feet is really, it's twofold. One is, yes, we want to put the structure on there, but it also, we're lowering the children's library down 4 feet so that the children's library will be on one level, because it's quite a large room now compared to what they're in. And that really accommodated them and handicap and those kinds of things, and just made for a better situation for them. So just wanted to make sure you knew that that's coming down, and it prevented us. And because of the load of books, we would have had to have that reinforcement. On the other side where the community room is, that is on surface, and there's no structural because we don't have the book load. So that's kind of the clarification.
And Steve, and the clarification too is that because of a slope factor in the parking garage, that 4 foot will not interfere with parking places. I think the public needs to know that all of this does not interfere with any parking spaces within the parking garage. Thanks, Jody.
Okay, any further questions, Rachel?
No further questions. We've been looking at this project progressing, and I'm real excited to see it moving this far. And I think I said this once before, but I really appreciate the sense of partnership with the city. If it weren't for the partnership to begin with the county, there wouldn't be a parking garage. And now, certainly there's some awkward and a lot of technical work to be done to use our easement and allow the library to grow as was originally envisioned. But as it is, I'm happy to see it moving forward. And I know there's going to be a long truck to see both of them completed, but it seems, again, good coordination going forward. So I would make a motion to approve an emergency ordinance authorizing the execution of an easement agreement with the city of Aspen.
Second?
Okay, I believe this is a public hearing today, is that correct, John?
It is not. The public hearing will come at the
Is on the
confirmation of
confirmatory reading?
Right.
Okay.
But it's the board's discretion to
Take public comment.
And looking at the audience, I don't think anybody from the public is here to comment on this. I think it's echoing what Rachel said. To me, it's awesome that we're finally going to get going on this library project, and I'm actually surprised that we're this close to the beginning of the construction, and here we are doing this little work on the easement, so.
hence the emergency.
That's why it's an emergency ordinance, so.
Okay.
Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, you sure may.
To the commissioners and to the public out there, we are having a groundbreaking at 4 p.m. on Tuesday, February 17th. The commissioners will be on hand. The library board will be there, staff. So please come join that celebration. It's 4 o'clock, followed by a little open house and tours of the building, and we'll answer any questions we can there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And could I just chime in and thank John Ely and
Yes, thank
Jim
you, John.
True from the city for all of their work on this, and Jody Smith and Jim Curtis. Thanks for your attention, too.
Thanks.
Steve, can we take a break before we head into the
Okay.
special events regulations? I'm pretty sure that's going to be a lengthy discussion.
Yep, that's a good idea, Rachel. Want to do a 10-minute break?
Yep.
So, let's make it 1:45, 13 minutes.
Very good.
I haven't had anything to eat, so.
1:45?
It's something to keep us
February 11th, regular meeting of the Board of County Commissioners. Our next item is a land use action ordinance adopting special events regulations. And this is a continuation of the first reading. And Mike Kramer is here. Alan Richmond, consultant, is sitting with him.
Thanks, Steve. Mike Kramer with Picken County Planning Staff. Next to me, Alan Richmond, and also the very hoarse Cindy Hoogan. And we're continued first reading. We both heard this first reading on January 28th of this year, and what you had was an ordinance and a whole staff packet for code amendments to amend special events and other temporary activities in the county. And the way we had originally wrote it was we had it broken up into 3 different ways: the rural and remote, the rural, and then the urban. So 3 different areas of the county we try to distinguish. And at this meeting we discussed a whole bunch of things, but in the end the board directed staff to rewrite the ordinance to amend it to only address a rural and remote zone district, and then also special event venue legislation. So that's what we did. There was also number of other bullet points that we addressed, and I'll go quickly through these and I'll focus on one part of them. We were directed to cross-reference the special events venue section and the noticing requirements, and we have made that change in the ordinance. We increased the attendance limits in the rural and remote zone district, and we also established an overall cap for that zone district of 250 attendees. We have created a temporary structure / tent definition, and that's in Chapter 11. We've included that in the ordinance. We created a time limit for temporary structures associated with special events. That's in the ordinance. And then also there was discussion about special events venues and the need for an annual review that we typically do for special review uses in the county. That's in there too. And one of the main points that we focused on were amending the ordinance to eliminate the urban and rural special event sections of it. And that was actually quite easily done by eliminating those, if you remember, those standards and threshold charts we had. And if you remember, we had a rural and remote, a rural and an urban, and we simply just taken out the rural and the urban portions of that. And in tandem with that, we also created an exemption for private parties. And in the staff packet on page 1, we've italicized and indented on page 1 some language that we proposed to specifically event private and non-commercial events. And what we did was that we proposed this language in the ordinance, and then as the week progressed and Alan and I were thinking, and wherever you are in your day when you are thinking about land use code legislation, we thought we could add some better language to further clarify how that exemption for private parties and non-commercial uses would work. So right up on the screen here, this is what we now propose to say. And I'll just quickly frame this. We have exempted the urban and rural areas from our thresholds and standards that we were showing you in the last meeting. And we've also added this language. And in your packet you have here where it says private and or non-commercial special events that take place on private property within the Aspen urban growth boundary and the Salt urban growth boundary, or within the rural areas of Picken County, are exempt from the requirement to obtain a permit. And that satisfies what we're looking to do here. We will, as status quo, keep on regulating special events as we always do. What we want to add to further clarify is that the special events venue portion of the code should, or I should say not should, but would capture some of these events. And what we're trying to capture are these private, non-commercial events that would occur in the rural area at a venue property. So a distinction there. We're trying to exempt these private non-commercial events from obtaining a permit like we have always done, but we are trying to bring forward the venue portion of our land use code amendments here. And in the venue portion, if you remember, a venue is defined by having 3 or more special events in 1 calendar year. So what we've added here on the underlined is, provided the event takes place on private land owned by the person or persons who are having the special event, private and/or non-commercial events that take place on private land owned by someone other than the person or persons having the event shall conform to the provisions of this code defining and regulating special event venues. So what that means is that, I'll just give an example here, and hopefully I can explain this, is that if someone who owns property in the county wants to have a private party like a wedding or a funeral at their party or at their property that they own, they do not require a special event permit with the county. But with this language, if someone had a property in the county and they were approached by someone who did not own that property to have an event like a wedding, like whatever other private event you would have, they would be required to not obtain a special event permit, but those would count against their 3 events at that property. And once they had those 3 events in a calendar year, they would then jump into our special event venue portion of these code amendments, and then the county then could require a special review for that. I hope I've explained that correctly.
Yeah,
Or simply at least.
I just have a quick, how do we monitor that?
It would be tough. It'd be a tough thing to monitor. We would mostly hear from the neighbors, hopefully, if there was an issue, if there was an event that seemed or smelled like an event that wasn't owned by someone who owned that land.
I think we hope, the true venue properties, if they want to get on the right side of this thing, they just say, let's get out in front of it, let's get the permit so that we're not being hassled. But the whole point here is your special event regulations are what trigger having to come into the special event venue regulations. And since we exempted this whole type of activity from needing the special events permit, that being the private party, if it's McCabe Ranch or it's the Chaparral Barn or whatever it is, has a whole series of private parties, I don't think that's what this board was thinking it wanted to exempt. Those are the things that we want to be addressing. I was meeting with the Woody Creek Caucus on Monday night. And I was meeting with them about something else, and all we could talk about was special events. And these special event venues are terribly important to them. It's like, I think we need to clean up this language because we were missing a whole segment of activity that they're very concerned about.
Rachel and then Michael.
Just to clarify, I think what you're saying is that the events would count against the property as opposed to each potential partial owner of a property would get 3 events. Is that what you're saying? So that if a barn like Chaparral is owned in common by all the different property owners, it would be, the counts against the venue itself to see if it starts to kick into special event venue activities. The number of times it's used, not the number per individual.
Right. Exactly what you just said. That's what we're trying to capture is the property itself.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the bigger concern is people from the county at large coming to that property and saying, we want to rent that property, but it could happen simply from inside the property. You're right.
Exactly. Okay. Thank you.
Michael?
Well, I don't quite understand how a barn, and that's how it's approved, it's a barn, for equine purposes or cattle purposes or whatever, then has a subsequent definition as a venue. When was that? Who made that? The only person who made that jump was the person who says the person who said that could be a venue. Are you telling me that barns are now defined as a venue in the code?
No, you have, the way this is all written, we've created a rather stiff threshold for that to be designated as a venue. You've got to go through the special use review process, which is a public hearing in front of this board, with not only all the special use standards that you're familiar with, but a specific set of additional standards that we've placed against the special events venues, including what was it originally approved for, and was this contemplated, and what was there thinking that, for example, we allowed this size barn because it was an agricultural facility, and we never would have allowed it if it were commercial. So, no, Michael, there's no automatic. Quite the contrary, this is setting a very high bar for those facilities to have to go through to become special events venues. Yes, they can ask, but there's no right. It's a discretionary review by this board with input from the caucus with the entire set of land use standards to govern that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, speaking certainly for the Whitaker caucus, there was expectations that the approvals of these various areas was based on a residential use, agricultural use, and the morphing to another use, particularly the special events use, was not contemplated by anyone, including the original applicant. So now we're adding a use that's possible, and I mean, my feeling is that that's a mistake. I don't think we should even allow for the possibility of that. We're essentially expanding the possibility of uses within areas that hadn't contemplated that. I guess someone could give me a good reason to do that, but I can't think of one offhand.
George?
Well, maybe one reason would be, this is just for special events venue. It's not for someone who wants to have a private wedding or gathering of their friends on their property in their own barn.
Correct.
So by allowing barn use as a special events venue, what that does was it eliminates the need to have an additional large structure put on that property. So if they would not be allowed to have use of that barn, then they would have to apply for a 15,000 square foot tent to be placed on their property. Is that correct?
That's a possibility, yeah.
So one way you're eliminating the addition of another structure temporary by being able to utilize an existing structure.
Well, but you've done something different. We're not regulating that private use of that barn. If that individual owns that barn and his daughter's getting married, he can use that barn. No questions asked. What we're really doing is we're saying, aside from the agricultural use of that barn or structure, 20,000-foot barn that was just approved in Old Snowmass, we can now apply for the designation of that structure as a venue location. And that actually is an expansion of use, as far as I'm concerned. And that venue location then can essentially get subscribers to have events there. They can, because they can make money at that. So I just don't see that expansion as being particularly helpful. I understand in terms of definition, because we're struggling with an already existing use, but I'd hate to expand use. So.
Well, I think the statement that you just made actually is a large part of it. This is an activity that we know is going on in the county today. And frankly, the code today isn't giving the staff much ability to get its arms around it. And so the first effort I think that we made in addressing the special event venue was to give the county serious tools to be able to say, now hold it, what you're doing there is a use that we define and regulate, and frankly, you're not permitted by any of your current approvals to engage in that. And so if you would like to do that, there is a process to ask, but there's certainly no expectation that you have a right to get that use. Now, we do have a section still here in the regulation that is a reserved section, where we've identified the ability, as you've just been discussing, individual rules for individual caucuses. We've left an opening in here for caucuses to weigh in and say, here's how we would like to address one aspect of special events or another. And we've yet to get all of that input. We know that that's still forthcoming, and that's partly why we're not adopting the threshold tables for the rural and the urban area at this point. And it's possible that some of the caucuses will say, you know, we've studied this special events venue, And for the following reasons, here's why it's not for us. It's not for this area of the county. And this board could make a decision to prohibit that use in certain areas. Right now, we've prohibited it based on zone district. And we've prohibited it in many zone districts in the county, primarily the small lot zone districts. So the larger lot zone districts, like in Woody Creek or in Old Snowmass or Emma, this use is allowed by special review in this draft. But on the other hand, in our more urban or higher density areas where having a venue would impact everybody around in significant ways, it's been prohibited. So there's certainly precedent for prohibiting it in areas if it's inappropriate.
I think on page 28 of our packet, it has the wording talking about, and maybe I should just read it, it really clarifies it.
I put it up here too.
Yeah, B, the section B really is explicit in what, so if something was approved as a horse barn, and now they're using it as a special events venue and it was not approved for that, that's pretty explicit on saying it can't be used for that unless, I mean, they could come back in and apply for a special venue thing, but it's not a given that they're allowed.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's up to the board then and the caucus input to determine whether or not it should be allowed to be a special event venue. I think perfect example is the Red Barn up the Crystal. When that came in as a barn and it's now a special event venue and it's handled really well, but very specifically. The impacts are, mitigated off the site and it works really well, but it's also got a, pretty close location to 133, so, and it's all done by, but it's come across really well and it's accepted by that neighborhood with lots of concerns at the beginning, and I think those concerns were addressed, and that doesn't mean that a barn in Old Snowmass would be appropriate for the heavy anything of a special event. So I think it comes back.
That language came directly out of the work session that we all
Right.
had back last September when we first presented these special event venue ideas. And Michael, I recall you raising concerns and George specifically about this issue, and that's exactly where that language came from, because we don't want to give people the misapprehension that this is just going to be an easy path to run through. I think we've set a pretty high bar.
Rachel.
Yeah, I guess it's my perception right now that this is a little bit of the Wild West out there because we don't have firm regulations for our staff to work with. And to my mind, this doesn't grant anyone any automatic, use, but it's a fine line to tread between private property rights and the enjoyment of one of your properties, a party and a right to assemble versus when does it become commercial, when does it become a commercial activity with impacts on the neighbors. And I think that this tries to balance those. And it would be my impression that if someone did come in for a special event venue permit, that we would be able to place limitations on that you can have 4 a year or 1 per every 3 months or whatever, and be able to start to set the standards, as opposed to right now, I don't know, other than, what ability we really have to say no, or to say that you've, gone beyond a 50-person gathering, it's now 500, love fest. We can't see that happen. So I'm comfortable moving this forward, and I think that the important thing is the review that the board will make before they make a determination on that permit and what conditions they'll place on it. They might say, yes, you can have 10 a year, but you can't have more than 50 people at a time. There's just a lot of variations, and it would be unique to the unique property.
Yeah, I think the effort that we've made here is to say, you want to have a wedding for your daughter on your property? Fantastic. But if a barn facility in the county is going to run 10 weddings a year on its property, I understand it's still a private wedding on private property, and that was the loophole that we were about to create in the language that we had in the packet. 10 private parties on private property is a commercial activity. It can be closed to the public, I get it, but it seemed to me to be the kind of thing that this board was concerned with.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to capture.
And that, and that's, I think that we're going in the right direction, and maybe I'm jumping the gun on it, but how does that bring in the assessor's determination of that property? Because, the concerns I think that were brought forward were the impacts of the events and how many events on a private property that weren't private events. And the other thing was the property assessment. Is it still agriculture, or is it then become commercial property? And I don't know if we have anybody from the assessor's office, but we were looking at that angle too. I don't know if that's coming up next time around.
I think they're going to look at that on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
In terms of the number of.
So what Cindy said was, she thinks they're going to look at that by case-by-case basis. They base a lot on the numbers of events and the number of people and the use. Okay. I think that's another key thing that people were expressing at our first meeting, is that.
Oh, Michael.
Well, if that's the case, I mean, say, there's a lot of relationships here. If that's the case, if it then indeed is a commercial venture in a barn, then you've made the case for marijuana production in a barn, because people are asserting that it's a commercial venture. So now you've set a precedent of saying this is a commercial venture in an agricultural barn, and therefore I can do commercial activities in this barn. It gets very complicated. It's not simple, and a lot of people, it's precisely why they're in the country, is they don't want a commercial venture in their midst. And interestingly enough, I mean, in the previous generations, you wanted to celebrate in an area where you had a city and a church and your neighbors and your friends. You didn't want to go out to the country to do it. You came into town. I mean, if you read the history of the Roaring Fork Valley, people walked all day to get to town to go to a dance. They didn't have the dance at their barn. So we have a complete reversal of social trends now, where people are exiting the cities to have their parties in the country, whereas in previous generations they gathered in the city and the churches and the social clubs, the Elks and the Eagles, to have their parties. So it's a very hard thing to do, and I mean it's a very hard thing for me to adjust to, that all of a sudden we're designating venues, which we've never had before, and that now is treading the line between agricultural use or commercial use, and will be taxed perhaps accordingly, at least on an individual basis. It seems to me you can't do it on an individual basis. You have to do it on a designation basis. And it's very complicated. I'm just trying to raise these questions because I think we need to consider them, and they're complicated.
These are difficult issues, and we have included in here, just to be clear, the traditional venues that you mentioned, whether it's the school or it's the community center or the religious institution. We recognize that those are appropriate places for special events to take place, and no permit is required to make those into special events venues. So your point is well taken. Those are very appropriate places in our society for these events to take place, but people have also chosen to bust out of that more limited sphere and go in rural areas. You're right.
Rachel.
Yeah, I would just want to emphasize, we have not designated anyone anything. We have just created a code framework in which we can designate as neighborhood input and uses become apparent. But again, it's a little bit of the Wild West out there right now. We don't have these standards to be able to bring things back into conformance and to take care of neighborhood impact. So I'm comfortable moving this forward, and I don't want to continue to muddy up with the various tangentials associated with this. And I think we can improve this code as we go forward if any additional loopholes or issues seem to arise. But I think this is the first opportunity we really have to restore some balance to neighborhoods that do not want to see barns default become special event venues. We now have more power, or we will have more power when this is passed. So I'd like to move it forward.
I got a couple of questions, if we back up a little bit. On the rural remote grid, threshold grid, which is page 68 of our, 26 of our packet, a major event permit is required, you have more than 100 but not to exceed 200. And then down under line item number 3, you say no more than 250 persons shall congregate. So those numbers don't jive, so we need to correct that? Or?
Yeah, you guys use 200.
But then you say no more than 250 shall congregate for an event in rural remote zone district.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, there's an error there, you're right.
so what's the number that you're suggesting? No, max 250, not to 200?
The top one has limit of 100, and then it's 250, and
My notes say at the first reading on January 28th, the threshold for to raise the top one up to 200. And I don't know why I put 250 in number 3.
So then that needs to be corrected under item number 3.
You are correct.
No more than 200.
That's the note
Okay.
that I have, if that's still acceptable to this.
All right, I just want to
Good catch,
clarify that.
George. Good catch.
The other, a few other questions. I know we've delineated urban and rural areas at this point, but when you talk about urban areas, I suspect that's in the UGB, and then how does that, our ability to do something within the UGB on our own versus having to then coordinate with the municipalities?
Well, the urban growth boundary minus the city of Aspen is still Pickens County's jurisdiction. And the way we've handled it in the past is that when a special event does come in, apply for a parcel of land within the UGB, we always refer it out to the city of Aspen for comment. That's how we typically handle land use applications. That's how we've always handled special events. So there's some interface with the two jurisdictions, and Basalt too.
On the, I've had a chance to sit in a couple different caucus meetings, and there's another one coming up in Emma in a week or so. And just sort of preliminary comments back from the caucus areas and the rural areas is that they don't really see a need to regulate, require a special permit for a wedding, a gathering, a memorial, things like that. So, and I think we'll get more of those comments, but I've been telling the caucuses that, and I just want to make sure that this will happen, is that staff is going to go back out, provide them with sort of an abbreviated version of these 78 pages, so they could focus just on rural areas, and also provide some examples, you know, what if. Some of the comments that I received were concerns regarding impacts, so impacts on parking, impacts of noise, impacts of fireworks. But the general feeling I was hearing was that they didn't feel that they needed to go through a permit process to have a gathering on their own private property that's not a special events venue.
I think that's right.
And that's what this does. just
No,
so
I understand. I just
For the
passing
public
on
to be
some
clear,
comments that I've
that's
heard.
what we're doing here.
Yes.
I have three points or questions to clarify. One had to do with the first slide you had up there, Mike. My question is, if a person is leasing a property and that's their residence and they want to have a party, the way it's worded, you would have to be the owner to be non-exempt, but if you're leasing a place and you want to have a party there, I think provision should be made for that somehow.
Owned or occupied.
So maybe tying it to the person's residence, whether they own it or lease it, might be a way to get around that. I'd hate to have somebody who's leasing a place not be able to have a party without going in and getting a permit, whereas if they owned the property, and then we have to be sure that somebody doesn't just go rent a place
That's
on
what
a
I was gonna
short-term
say.
basis in order. to have a big party. That's the thing, we want to not go too far that
So
direction
you're
either.
saying it can't be a special event lease? Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's a good point.
Second, let's see, second point, where you talk about the county's special events committee, which I didn't read everything word for word, but I was thinking maybe that should be put in the definitions section or somewhere to just clarify who is the county's special events committee, which different people or positions serve on that.
Sure.
And then the third point, you talk about that the rural area would be exempt from the requirement for a special events permit. But if you look on the attached, let's see, table 4-1, the different zone districts and what's the allowed and special use, so that would be on page 13 in our packet. Under the rural districts, that whole big block on the left side, you have the rural and remote as one of the columns of that.
Am I on the right table here?
Yeah.
Steve? Okay.
So you have rural and remote. It's included in the rural district. And so that's like a contradiction that you're saying you don't need a special event permit in a rural area given those conditions, and yet there's the rural and remote right there where you do need it. So the wording needs to be clarified on that, the statement you had up at the beginning, maybe say, or within the rural area with the exception of in the rural and remote zone
That can be
district.
clarified, yeah. I understand what you're saying there.
Yeah.
Good point.
Steve, I'm a little confused on your first point, though, when you talked about a leasee or someone having the ability to rent a facility on someone else's property.
Well, if somebody was renting the house, that's their residence, and they want to have a party there, they should be allowed to have the party
Right.
if that's their residence without going and getting a special.
Right, but I thought you said that if somebody else wanted to use that property for a wedding or something.
Well, somebody might say, we want to hold a big wedding, so we're going to go rent this house on this property
Right.
just for the purpose of holding the big wedding there. That's not really their residence.
But why wouldn't we allow that if it's, wouldn't that fall under a special events venue? Or it's not, they're not using it perhaps more than 3 times, it's a one-time deal. So for example, ABLT has an annual event every year at a different barn. They don't own the barn, someone else does, but they're using that for their annual event.
He's talking about renting the whole property, not just the facility. You're saying like if I have a house that has a barn and I'm renting that property and I want to have an event in the barn that's on the property, that I'm leasing the whole property, rather than just I'm going to rent the barn, I'm renting the whole parcel because that's where I live. I think that's the difference. Does that make sense?
Well, I just heard, I was trying to clarify what you were saying, Steve, because I was hearing 2 different things, and I use ABLT as an example, so.
You know, I think it comes back to the rights that you accrue to yourself by entering into a residential lease. It generally includes the quiet enjoyment of the property and use of the property and things like that. So, you know, a lease is a form of ownership rights. I think the way to define it, and Patty's kind of hit on that, is to say that, you know, maybe they have to, you know, have a residential lease for 6 months or for a year or something like that. But it's different to lease property for the residential suite of rights that come with ownership of property. They're kind of temporarily transferred to you because you've leased those rights from me, as opposed to someone leasing a barn for a 3-day period for an event. You know, that's very different. And the AVLT example you give, you know, that generally I've been to it, it's it is at a special event venue. It's at the Red Barn. It's not, I haven't seen it in other places. So you know, I just think that this begins to capture the difference between a long-term leasehold, still being able to enjoy your property and have a gathering there, versus someone who is leasing it short-term for the only reason of having the special event. You know, it'd be like a sublet from someone who, you know, I lease my property to you for a year to live there, and then you sublet it for a stranger to have a party on your event. That would trigger this. If you were leasing that property long-term and your daughter had the wedding there, it would not trigger this.
Yeah, I guess I'm not stating my concern correctly. I'm not talking about leasee. I'm talking about if I wanted to have a wedding utilizing someone else's property because they have a facility that can handle it. Would I have to go through a special event permit, or would that?
No, you'd be fine if that property were routinely and regularly used for that purpose, not just you recognized its ability, but it's having 3, 4, 5 such things a year, then it is becoming a venue. So it's not your party that triggers that, it's how is that property
The number
being
of parties
used?
in a year.
Right, all right, yeah.
Yeah, just so you know, Mike and I are kicking around using the word occupied. So in reference to Steve's comment, owned and occupied, as opposed to owned or leased by a person. And so if you're occupying it, you're the renter, you're the whatever, but you're somebody you're residing there. We thought of, we'll kick this around,
Yeah,
we'll talk
'cause-
to John about it and come up with the right language, but
Yeah.
that was the term that I thought might respond to your concern.
Patty and then Michael.
There could be expanded definitions of the word occupied, like the outhouse is occupied when the little switch goes over, you know, so you have to kind of be careful with that one.
That's why I said, we'll talk to
All
John
right.
about this.
How long is the occupation?
We'll get the right word to respond to Steve's comment, which clearly is an important one.
Okay, Michael?
Yeah, you know, I understand what Rachel's saying about, well, if we give the opportunity to designate it as a venue, then essentially we extend some control over the use of the place. But along with that, if you were to designate a barn as a venue for gatherings, then it seems to me you would have to then see if that barn met building code requirements for occupation by 250 people.
Oh, yeah.
And so then all of a sudden you go from a barn to a commercial structure, and then does the barn have to be sprinkled? Does it have to have ADA? Does it have to be free of combustible materials, like hay? Does it, you know, what actually then does it become? Seems to me it definitely becomes then a high occupancy commercial structure and no longer a barn. So now you've injected commercial use in areas that, and certainly in Woody Creek, they have specifically said we don't want expansion of commercial properties. So now you've said, okay, we'll have expansion of commercial properties. And you have to worry about the health and safety of people, particularly high occupancy people with candles and lots of lighting and God knows what. Are there appropriate number of exits, and can we get people out of this building? Can we suppress fires? What's the deal here? So, you know, this becomes a very complicated thing other than the designation of venue. So, you know, it's tough. I wouldn't want a party where there's 250 people and not enough exits for them.
So wouldn't that be encompassed in a permit process in terms of a check-off list? Do you have this, do you have that, right down the line? And is that one of the criteria?
Exactly. Yeah. I think that language that we inserted, that B, Steve, that we had up earlier, I think that gives the board a tool to evaluate how that, for example, what Michael's talking about, a barn or an agricultural building was permitted and approved as in conjunction with a request to have a special events venue at that building.
Specifically, the language under special events venue says, it's talking about the submission contents. The plan shall also provide responses to the applicable review standards for special events that are listed in section blank. This shall include describing how the venue will provide an adequate water supply, properly dispose of sewage and solid waste, provide parking, control impacts such as traffic, noise, lighting, dust. And within that list under special events are all the building code and safety issues. We can add building and safety issues if you'd like to that list, but it absolutely is required that you have specific responses, because the building inspector has every right to, and does, regulate those issues for special events.
Yeah, but then the venue becomes essentially a permanent commercial structure.
Or it doesn't, because it can't meet any of those standards.
Right.
I mean, this is the way to say, here's why it doesn't, and give you a totally legitimate way to say, that's an unsafe facility to have the kinds of events that you're planning.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, you do it right off the bat, which is to say, there's no commercial zoning in this area, and it would be necessary to have a commercial zoning in order to have this commercial use. So you're out of here.
I was trying to use that same argument earlier today.
Well, and that's, I was agreeing with you earlier too, that if you do designate marijuana cultivation rather than agricultural enterprise as a commercial enterprise, then you're right. But so far it's...
I still want to go back to the one point, is that we have not designated anything, and we're not required to designate anything. You know, someone comes in and says they want a special event review, and the neighborhood and the caucus and the individuals say, we do not want that here, we'd like to close it down. This code will give us that ability to do that. You know, it's not as if there's some sort of automatic criteria and people will apply and we'll suddenly have 25 special event venues throughout the county. Each one will be individually heard, looked at, conditions, if any, if it's approved. And so, you know, this is not creating any sort of entitlement. It's going to be discretionary by the board to grant that ability going forward in the future, and that will happen with neighborhood and community input.
And also, Rachel, there's a yearly review if somebody is a special venue. They have to come back in.
So it doesn't end up being, it can be revoked in the future.
Yeah, so that's a safety mechanism. If something's just not working, we can find that out right away. George?
I was just going to say, part of the purpose of this is to, at least for the timing for the rural remote moratorium, was to be able to inform event planners. And so an event planner who's thinking about having a function in a rural area at either an existing structure or putting up a temporary structure will have to go through this process.
Yeah. Frankly, I really think it's time to get something on the books as a start, you know, because June weddings are pretty popular, and that's coming up really soon. And we've done a lot of work with this. There's been a lot of outreach to the caucus. I think it's pretty far along. I'd like to move it forward.
Let's see, this is this isn't a public hearing. Next time would be.
If I may, Steve, this is a continued first reading, which is a public meeting for this ordinance, and we had set scheduled for today, actually, the second reading public hearing. What we would do is we'd recommend to adopt this at first reading, our public meeting, and then continue second reading, our public hearing, to February 25th.
February, okay. Do you
want a motion?
I would accept the motion.
Okay, this is
yes,
a fun
please.
one. I'm going to do a motion to approve on first reading, I better put my glasses on, the ordinance adopting special events regulations, and this is specific to, do I need to put that in there? Just the rural remote area?
Specific to rural and remote zone district and the special events venue portion.
And then we're going to continue or move it to a second reading public hearing on February the 25th. Do I need to add anything else to that?
As amended with the new language that Alan...
Right, as amended with the new language that has been proposed.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Michael?
Yeah, you know, I can't approve it because, I mean, I can't go forward with it because we're all of a sudden, we're going to designate areas of the county that are rural and inject commercial activities in those rural areas. We're just going to do that. I'm not gonna support that. The possibility of it. I mean, the way to go, quite frankly, is you've got a horse barn, it's a horse barn. And that's what it's zoned for. That's what their surrounding zoning is. That's how you got it. It was agricultural. There's no conversion here. You want a salon de fiesta? You know, go to Carbondale. You know, rent a room in the city. Do not turn our rural areas upside down. That's pretty simple, because we're restructuring now zoning. We're doing all kinds of things here by creating this venue designation, and I think it goes against our rural zoning.
Yeah. Michael, I can only think of two instances, the Oak Mountain Lodge and the Flying Dog Ranch on Prince Creek, as designated things that you would call designated venues at this point. Is there any other properties that have that kind of approval?
I'm going through my head right now. Those are the two that always come to mind.
Well, Elk Mountain Lodge is converted to a residence.
Exactly, yeah, but those
That's not
historically
any
were-
longer. Well, it was approved for
I
that.
don't think we do.
I can't think of anything else.
So anything that's currently being used, like the Chaparral Barn that's being used as a venue, with these regulations, they would be shut off. They would then have to come and apply, go through the process if they wanted to continue holding events there and meet these strict criteria, which then that would be referred to the Woody Creek Caucus, and it would have to come before this board to decide whether it's an appropriate location or not. So they're not going to be grandfathered in to continue an operation like that. And I think we have plenty of opportunity to look at things, and maybe there are some locations that would be perfectly okay for that, for being a special
That's
venue.
what I'm saying, Steve. As it stands now, they're not permitted. That's the way I like it.
George?
I want to go back to this example because I'm still a little confused. ABLT. So last year, ABLT had their annual gathering at the Mislantic Ranch, and they put up a big tent structure. So what sort of process did they go through, and what would change with this ordinance?
They were in Garfield?
No, they're in Pitkin.
Or was that Pitkin?
Last year, I gotta remember.
Was that Pitkin?
It's usually at the, if I remember, the Nislanic barn, right?
Well,
up on the
this,
mesa.
Yeah, right, exactly.
it used to be on the Tie Bar.
Tie bar, okay, yeah, I'm getting
But this year it was on the Nislanics, which I think is in Garfield County, so.
I think it's Garfield.
What I can speak to is that when it was at the Tie Bar Ranch, they applied for a special event permit. In fact, ABLT had done it so many times there that we gave them a 3-year permit, so they didn't have to keep on coming back to us and applying for a special event. So that's a public event. Any of us can go buy a ticket to it. It's open to the public. I think they serve liquor there, and they got a liquor license from us too for that. That would not change for the ABLT event, okay? But if that property had multiple events now, as we define special events venues, they would be subject to our land use code and be required to get a special event venue designation.
So another example, Soapers Mountain Ranch, if they want to have a venue that, special events that have ongoing polo matches, and they want to set up some tents and utilize, not for the HOA, but to bring people in as an ongoing special event, how would this address that?
Well, if I remember correctly, Soapers Mountain Ranch has common area, and they have if I remember correctly, a field out there too. So as a common area, and as people that own it, they can use that property for events. Now, but if they have more than 3, they would fall under our venue section here then.
Okay.
Okay, any further discussion? Michael?
So if it doesn't hit the venue section, but people are having a party in the barn, whatever, what is the public safety protection for those people?
What's the question if the?
Well, if they have a barn and it's just on one event, they have that, it's a barn, it's not meant to gather 250 people in it. So they start adding extension cords and lighting around certain areas, and all of a sudden you've got the potential for a public disaster, and people are going to say, well, you should have known ahead of time that you weren't protecting the public. I mean, well, I don't quite get it. I mean,
It's my understanding, though, that we haven't gotten to the rural or the urban issues of how many people would trigger a permit, et cetera, et cetera. So if you had, 50 people at your house, I'm just throwing out a number, and you're having a party in your barn or in your backyard with a tent, and it was a private wedding, you wouldn't have to do anything. But if you're going to use your barn for 100 or 250 people, you're going to have to go through a process that would then have those criteria. You have to have outhouses, you have to have trash mitigation, you have to have parking off-site, all those things can then be addressed as part of that.
That's what we had contemplated in the
I mean,
original
we haven't gotten to
iteration.
that, but that's
Yeah.
kind of the direction I think that.
People have asked us at this point to back off on private properties on private land in the urban and rural area, and that's what this does. You bring up a quite valid point, and that was why the regulation was originally written, to address those kinds of things at some threshold level. Presumably, we'll be coming back addressing that, but for the time being, the situation is status quo. That opportunity exists today to go into your barn with X number of people, and it may or may not be a safe situation. We haven't changed that today. We'll continue to gather information from the caucuses and see where those thresholds gain some comfort. You've heard several caucuses, we just got a letter from the Crystal Caucus saying, we don't think we have a problem here. We've gotten that letter from the Frying Pan Caucus saying, we don't think we have a problem.
Well, let me just, that wasn't from the Crystal Valley Caucus, that was from an individual.
Sorry.
We need to clarify when we start getting letters who say they're representing the caucuses, but they're really not, because caucuses, they're waiting to get this information from staff so they can actually address it in a caucus meeting.
Okay.
And then I think Michael's points will be a really valid part, a really important part of that discussion. Because we want to be able to put a handle on that if we need to, and I think if people are going to have events that put people at risk, then there may be some need for intervention, because a lot of people don't take those things into consideration when you're throwing a huge bash in your barn. But others do take that into consideration, so.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve this with the changes and additions in the wording, which you'll bring those changes back to us at the second reading.
Right.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
I'm opposed.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have two land use public hearings, which both are planned to be continued. And do we need to?
We generally open the public
Open the
comment?
public, I need to open the public hearing in case anybody wants to comment about.
Leave it open, right?
those.
We continue. So we open it and continue it, right, Steve? Is that
And
what-
then we get a motion to continue.
Do you want a motion
So-
for each one separately, or?
Let's do each one separately. The first item's the land use code amendment with the special events regulations. The second reading had been scheduled for today. I will open the public hearing, and seeing as how we don't have any audience here, I presume nobody wants to speak on that. So I'll close the
No,
public.
you continue it. Continue the public hearing? You continue it.
The public hearing will be continued till February 25th, and I would need a motion to continue.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Second issue is the Ecuador North Bolivia parcel site plan review and special review. which was scheduled for today, they had a noticing error. Does anybody in the public wish to comment on this today? And hearing none, I will close. The
Continue.
public hearing will continue on the date of February 25th. So I'd accept a motion to
So moved.
continue that. Is there a second? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
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 That's a tough one to remember, when to close, when to open, when to...
Okay, we don't have any, it's not listed to have open discussion. Normally we have that on there. Is that an
Yeah, it looks
omission?
like that was an omission today.
We could still do open discussion right now if anybody has anything.
Oh, Steve, one small thing, just for our staff, I think that as per kind of our policy, they need to notify the applicants that on the 25th, it will not be a full board. They'll be hearing without Patty and myself.
No, I'm here.
Patty
Okay.
will be here.
But at least myself, so just, just so people know.
Okay. Thanks for that reminder, Rachel. Let's see, I'm trying to think of the order of things. We would adjourn the regular meeting after we do the executive session. So right now, we would need as a motion to go into executive session for the purpose of attorney advice pursuant to what statute?
CRS 24-6, 402, 4B.
4B.
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, thank you, Grassroots. We'll take a 5-minute break while he breaks down, and then we want to meet in here.
Okay.